the hashtag FL Priorities to participate there. Our next panel here this morning is tackling a very challenging topic that truly affects all of us in South Florida. We're talking about guns. While mass shootings make headlines, gun violence is tragically a regular occurrence in too many of our communities. And perhaps you may not think it affects you and your community or your block, your town, your neighborhood. It does. In January, WLRN reported a series called Young Survivors, and we found that of children and teenagers over the last decade that made it to Ryder Trauma Center, 88% survived their gunshot wounds. These are survivors of gun violence that continue to live and work and go to school in our communities. Joining us shortly will be my colleague at WLRN, reporter Nadege Green. But first, please watch this video that is all too poignant of a reminder of the aftermath of daily gun violence in South Florida.
I try to watch movies about my son, look at his obituary, just think about him hard before I go to sleep, hoping, just come, I pray, like, just come to me, man, like, please, like, he won't come. Before I even know it, I'm waking up 4 hours later at the graveyard. My son was my team partner. Like, we did everything together. It wasn't nothing we didn't do. We'd play the game. He didn't want to be on the offense. I told him, you ain't got to be. Just when they say hike, go get whoever got the ball, jump on him, dive on him, man. He loved it, that game right there. Nah, it's just like I'm stuck, like, and I guess that's what come with it. I just pray hard and continue to ask the Lord to let his will be done. Whatever he got for me, just bring it on.
A reminder of that aftermath of gun violence that still lives in our community long after the tragedy of the violence itself. Please welcome to the stage the panelists to discuss gun and gun violence in South Florida, along with WLRN reporter Nadege Green. Thank you.
All right.
Greetings. We're going to jump right in. Well, Tom didn't introduce everyone, so I guess I will start with that. All the way to the end, we have Bob Mcclure with James Madison Institute in Tallahassee. We also have with us John Mill, who is currently working on writing the ballot initiative that would ban AR-15s in the state of Florida. We also have Megan Hobson. Megan is a local activist here, and she is also a survivor of gun violence. She was shot multiple times in Miami Gardens as a teenager. And we have Luther Campbell, rapper, activist, mainstay in Miami, and especially in Miami's Liberty City in the youth football scene. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm Nadege Green, social justice reporter with WLRN, who also covers gun violence. We're going to start with John, because this measure that you're working on has gotten a lot of attention statewide. Talk to us a little bit about what it is and why an AR-15 ban.
The why is very important. This morning I got off the phone with Gail Schwartz, who is chairing that initiative for the group Ban Assault Weapons Now, which is a bipartisan group, very bipartisan. And she was recalling how her nephew was shot through a wall at Parkland with an assault weapon. The reason that assault weapons would be singled out is simply because they kill more people. Say it again, they kill more people. They shoot more rounds. The rounds themselves have a 3 times greater impact than a handgun. If you're shot by a 9mm handgun in the same place that you were shot by an AR-47, the AR-47, you're dead. Talk to emergency room doctors. So the effort is, among the things you can do, is get the most dangerous military-type weapon off the street. And I don't know how many fewer people would have died at Parkland or at Pulse, but it would have been. So the least we can do is try to get that off the street. That's the effort of that initiative.
And can you talk a little bit about the how? How does this end up on a ballot before voters for 2020?
Well, everybody gets a chance. It'll be an initiative, and those that are in favor of this can sign it and can go on that website of bawnfl.org and get an initiative and sign it. Need to be 800,000 people, and then it could go to the ballot. And one of the interesting things is Florida does interesting things on the ballot. We just in Amendment 4, restored felon voting rights, which you would wonder, is Florida a state that would do that? And yes, they did, by over 60%. So this isn't necessarily easy at all, but Florida surprises you sometimes.
That should be the headline.
Or maybe every time.
So we know what happened in Parkland. The tragedy in Parkland really brought to the forefront issues around gun control here in the state of Florida, and also what it means to be impacted by gun violence. But while mass shootings are horrors and they're horrible, in our communities, that is typically not the type of shootings that you see. Every day in the state of Florida, young people, women, men get shot on a regular. And this is something Luther Campbell, that you know very well, chairing the youth football troop in Liberty City and seeing what happens there. Most shootings on a neighborhood level are not high rifle assault rifles. They're everyday handguns. From a policy perspective, what are some of the things that you're looking at? What are some of the things you're hearing from community members when you're out talking about the impact that this has every day?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. The AR-15 is the weapon of choice for the drug dealers and gang members in the city. Just so you know that. So I support the effort to ban it. But at the same time, the reality of it all. You have, when young girls get out of high school, they become mules to the dope dealers and the drug addicts and the gang members.
And to define mules.
Mules, what they'll end up doing is they'll go for the drug dealer and they'll buy multiple weapons. They'll buy hundreds of guns and they'll get paid from the drug dealers because they have a clean record. That's the number one problem. Number two problem is, nobody's going to jail in the inner city. You kids are getting shot every day. Nobody is going to jail. Nobody's not going to jail, so you'll see on the TV, why isn't anybody talking in the community? Where's the community in putting these people in jail? When you don't go to jail and you know the killer is living next door to you, what ends up happening is they understand that nobody is going to go to jail, so nobody is telling on anybody. So from the outside looking in, you're saying, why isn't the community involved into putting these killers in jail? That is the situation. So we, as community activists, me and Tangela Sears and other mothers who fight for the rights of putting these killers in jail, we'll go and we'll talk to the state attorney and say, hey, look, bring the federal law enforcement involved in it. Before you know it, it's a pushback between the local police and the feds. The feds don't want to come in because they need to be grandfathered in by the local police. So it's a big challenge. I can go on and on, but I don't want to take up most of the time. It is a big challenge that we fight every day in our community to stop this gun violence, but it seems like everything goes on deaf ears. We ask the feds, if there's a gang, go in, RICO statute them, use your resources to put these people in jail. But the pushback is with the local law enforcement as well as the state attorney.
So we're talking two parts. We're talking about what can happen on a state level, but locally as well. Like in the city of Miami, for example, Washington Post just did a really powerful series on murders that go unsolved. And in the city of Miami, over the past 10 years, the majority of the murders are unsolved. Something like almost 70% of murders over the past 10 years are unsolved. And so you're talking about the repercussions of that. What does it mean when there is no justice after a shooting? Megan, I would love for you to also weigh in as someone who has lived this. to talk about when we mean, what does it mean to have a safe Florida, safe from gun violence? What does that mean for you?
For me, I think that safety would be not living in that fear that I'll be shot again. However, safety doesn't look the same to everybody. So there are some people who argue that with me and say, but safety to them is them owning a gun or them having a gun. And I do agree that there are a lot of people who won't speak because they know that no one's going to jail in my neighborhood. And I feel like, especially with my case is also one that has been unsolved, and I'm alive. So I think sometimes you would think that because the person survived, that they get more justice in their case, and it's not the same. It's definitely not. You are looked at as you survived, so you're good. What do you have to worry about? And that, to me, is not a safe Florida that I'd like to live in, because just thinking that I'm good after something that's already rocked my world is not really safety to me.
And when you say that, like, you're not good, what does that mean?
I think that when I left the hospital, one of the things they told me was, this is a lifetime recovery that you're looking at. And I knew what I was hearing, but I didn't know what that meant. But 6 years down the line, as I was shot when I was 16 and now I'm 23, I realized what they meant. After the first 3 years, you start to feel things you didn't know you were going to feel if they said that you would never feel things again. But it's more mental than it is physical. I feel physical pain every day when it comes to, as you see, I have a leg brace on now. My foot gives me the most problems, but I was not shot in my foot. I was shot in my pelvis. So I have a walking issue. So every day when I have to walk, every step I take hurts. So I have that lifelong issue. I also have the mental part of it, the triggers that come on, whether they be just seeing it in the media or knowing that I just passed a neighborhood where it happened last night. I think that for me, it weighs heavy on my mental daily. Even if I think today I woke up stronger, I know when I go to sleep and the nightmares come that I'm not as strong as I thought, you know? So.
And Bob, when we talk about mental health, this is something specifically that the James Madison Institute is interested in, and health in particular. Can you talk about mental health and trauma as we have this conversation about gun violence and what it means to live in a safe Florida?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Florida's a big and complicated state, and I don't need to tell anyone in this room that. The same state that just restored felons' rights for voting, which we at the James Madison Institute supported, is also the largest state in the country when it comes to concealed carry permits, more than Texas. Think about that dichotomy. And so this issue is really, really complicated. And I run a think tank based in Tallahassee called the James Madison Institute. And so to the question, I'd like to look at this in a little different light. It's kind of like, when many of us grew up on Sesame Street, and it was, you had the 10 things that were up there, and one of these is not like the other. And that is kind of my role here on this panel today. I think, when you look at gun violence, you had roughly about 40,000 deaths. That's not collateral damage. That's not, survivors, those kinds of things. About 40,000 deaths across the country. 60% of those were suicides. You think about that. And then when you add into that domestic violence, stalkers, those kinds of things, well over half of the gun deaths in this country, I would argue, reflect much of the mental health issue. And so I think the state of Florida needs to look at the mental health aspect, flagging those who have mental health problems. Whether it's Parkland or in my neck of the woods, the yoga studio in Tallahassee, which was just a few weeks ago, there were signs. These offenders should have been flagged. And these are major mental health issues that go unaddressed for fear, for embarrassment, for whatever the reason may be. And I think that's a major issue. I would also add a second component, and that is in many of these neighborhoods that Luther was talking about, and we were talking about with the violence, we need hope. We need hope. We need education. We need opportunity. We need economic opportunity. And it's hard to have hope without security and education and economic opportunity. And so many of the panels that have already come up here directly reflect some of the major issues when it comes to gun violence and gun deaths. And so as an organization that looks at things a little differently, those are the issues that I look at when it comes to the tragedy of gun violence and gun deaths.
And John, one of the things that we're seeing, especially right now, is that the conversation, whether it's banning AR-15s or around gun violence, is mostly youth-led, or at least it's making the most noise among youth. How's that conversation going around, particularly this petition drive, but largely what you're experiencing, what you're seeing?
That drive is been initiated by people who were associated with Parkland. So that was from young people, and young people get shot today. And you were hit with an assault weapon.
Yeah.
So it's even on the streets, it's assault weapons are dangerous. The youth are going to decide. As Luther said, that it's the education of people and people who care about the community. The community just needs to demand it. And yeah, it's more than just banning assault weapons. It's making the community a safe place. It's being better at mental health and education, so the community itself isn't as susceptible to it. But again, that's where it's going to happen. That's the energy, and I expect that to still be the energy.
Megan, can you talk a bit about, you were a teenager when you were shot, and you worked with youth, and you were talking with elementary school kids just this past week in Liberty City. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that not all youth are heard equally. Equity is a very big part of this conversation around gun violence, around anything happening in the state of Florida, is who gets to be heard, and who do we listen to? Can you talk to me about what some of the youth were telling you? These were elementary school kids.
These were 4th and 5th graders at Liberty City Elementary, and I wasn't not expecting to get the responses that I did, but it was gut-wrenching, nonetheless. And some of these kids, the first question that I did start with was, how many people in the room have been affected by guns? And the numbers, you start to see the hands go up, but I said, let me clarify what I'm asking. You know someone who's been shot, or your cousin, uncle, whoever it might be has been shot, even if it's not you, and all the hands went up. And this is a media center with about 45 kids, and these were kids who have never been heard before. These are kids who had questions regarding what does healing look like for me if I'm in the class, with someone who has been through the same thing, and I don't want to have hate in my heart for them, but they took away a life from me. And this is coming from 4th and 5th graders who, when I was in that room, I felt it and I said, this is the cycle. This is the beginning of the cycle. This is unheard trauma. This is unresolved trauma. And I think that what it leads to is more and more kids growing up lost and growing up trying to fix what they weren't given the better coping tools to deal with. So I heard kids in there saying, one of the boys told me he wants to have a march. And I said, well, why do you want to have a march? And he said, well, we're the ones getting shot. So I feel like we should be the ones telling them, put the guns down. And I was like, and you should, so I'll help you do the march. And he was like, well, we get people to come. And I said, let's see, we should. And it's as simple as that, but they haven't had the resources that Parkland has at the elementary school, obviously. But it doesn't mean that they don't have a story, they don't have a message, and they don't have a voice that should be heard.
And to that point, I was actually in Liberty about 2016, and there was a group of 3rd graders walking around Liberty Square chanting, we don't want to die, stop shooting, right? And Luther, you work with youth, and you see them as they grow, you see them go off to college, you see some who don't make it. What are some of those conversations having from a youth-led perspective on what are some of the things that they need? What are they saying that to keep me safe? Here are some of the things I need that maybe the adults are not hearing.
Well, I mean, you just showed a piece before the panel started on a young man, King Carter, and his dad. That kid came out of our program. And our program has been around for 30 years, and that's why, we speak on it because we see it every day, and we've seen it when they had some of the worst gangs like John Doe, and we saw how law enforcement got involved to get rid of those gangs. But then now you fast forward to today, you don't see the same activity as far as these different departments working together. But to answer your question, 99.1% of the time, if a kid gets shot or murdered or anything in Liberty City, 9 times out of 10, that parent or that kid, brother, sister, or whatever it may be, is located in our program. Go back to the mental aspect of it all. There's no resources in the community to even talk to those kids about the mental issues of it. We just have, as an organization, we just have to hold on to the kids and hope that they don't continue the same cycle that their brothers, parents are continuing. I mean, it is a real serious issue. And if everybody in this room right here, and this room is made up of totally different looking people than what the people look like in Liberty City, Overtown, Miami Gardens, Goulds, Homestead, Florida City, and all these areas, if these people in this room take an initiative and take a pledge themselves and say, I'm going to call up the chief of police, it goes on deaf ears when a black person goes and calls, because they're immune to it. But they're not immune to the people in this room here. Mm-hmm. They're not. If these people in this room call the state attorney and say, hey, look, state attorney, we are concerned about another part of our community. Yeah, we might don't live in Liberty City, but this is directly affecting us as well, because we're all Miamians. We're not just Miamians because we all love University of Miami or the Dolphins or the Heat, but we love Miami. And if people in this room right here put the pressure on the state attorney, the police chief, the mayors in these different areas, it'll change. I guarantee it'll change. But when it comes from us, it goes on deaf ears, and it's not an issue until there's a Parkland. When there's a Parkland, 17 kids get killed. We get 17 kids get killed in a month. More than that in Liberty City, and it's not an issue. But I say to everybody in this room who looks different than everybody in my community, that if you pick up the phone, if you send an email, it'll stop. I guarantee it'll stop.
Bob, I see you nodding your head.
There's no powerful testament than what you just heard right there. 17 kids in a month. I mean, gun violence and its collateral damage should not be mostly defined by the zip code in which you live. It really shouldn't. And I say mostly, not all, because we know that there are other places where it happens, but it shouldn't be mostly defined by the zip code in which you live. And so resources, hope, education, neighborhood security, opportunity, economic opportunity, job creation, it's far more than the Second Amendment, the Bill of Rights, gun control, and I'm using cliches on purpose. You're talking about real people, real families, real children, people like Megan and others who are affected by this issue. And what Luther has just said is just so compelling, because there's so much more to it than just simple sound bites that we see on cable news. And so at JMI, that's where we would come from on this. Let's look at mental health. Let's look at neighborhoods. Let's look at resources. Let's look at neighborhood security, being able to walk outside. I would venture to guess, to pick up on Luther's point, 99.9% of you all have no problem walking out at night to your car, to your, if your newspaper came at night. Of course it doesn't, but you know what I mean. You're not defined by your zip code in gun violence, probably, most of you. And so those are the kinds of issues that I wish Floridians and folks nationally would look at, in addition to the other kind of traditional cliches that we've seen.
And to that point, and you're absolutely correct, as a reporter who covers on gun violence, one of the things that I found is how people rearrange how they live as a result of living in unsafe neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
And so when you quantify what it means to be impacted by gun violence, while it is absolutely necessary to have tools within the law and policies to address that, it is absolutely how people live day to day. So it's parents who tell me all the time that my kids can't play outside. And so you have kids who get brand new bicycles, who will get brand new bicycles this Christmas, who will not get to use them unless there's a family member who has a pickup truck to pick them up to take them to a park that's not in their neighborhood. It is also parents who don't let their kids sleep in the big room with a window because they're afraid if there's a shooting, they can't keep their kids safe. That is a very real lived reality. And it's not just in Miami-Dade County. This is Tampa. This is Jacksonville. This is parts of Tallahassee as well. It's all over the state that we hear various versions of this story, which is our kids can't be kids as a result of this very real issue. Tampa Bay Times did a very interesting series. It was called In Harm's Way. I think this was about 1.5 years ago. From 2010 and 2015, nearly 3,200 kids 17 and younger were killed or injured by firearms in the state of Florida. Or within that time frame, every 17 hours, a child in the state of Florida was shot. I would love for you to weigh in, John, on how do you even get to start to talk about, because you work a lot with policymakers. You have figured out a way to at least have these conversations. So whether we're talking about on a local level or statewide level, what are some of the ways you can begin to make inroads in having these conversations, whether you're high-powered, law firm, lobbyists, but everyday people who need these tools, so maybe that they can bring it to their local lawmakers, if not in Tallahassee?
Putting a face on it. You're a person. You're sitting here. Luther's talking to people. People respond, even lawmakers, to humans. When I think about the Parkland shooting, like all of us, I probably looked at that on television and was terrified. Then when I ended up talking to some of the people, think that Alyssa and Martin and others, they're real kids who got up that morning and had breakfast with their parents and were thinking about going to dance class and think about doing something else, and they were dead. We have active shooter drills in schools everywhere. So while assault weapons is maybe an organizing principle, but there's a lot of other things we can talk about when we get together. But to me, the stories that there are individuals, and particularly young people, that have been harmed, it's hard to resist and to understand that, yes, you need to pay attention to assault weapons, mental health and education, and to the community and listen to people. I think it can work, and I think that with assault weapons is one of the issues that people can get behind, but getting that group together and let's talk about what happened to kids, to people. It's, I think I'm going to be an optimist and say I think our legislators and our leaders and our local leaders will listen. And I think these leaders are, and that's how you start. So how do you convey that message to the state attorney, the police chief? All those kids are important.
And Luther, how do we do that? How do you make it so that it's not, obviously the communities that are impacted lead the conversations, but how do you make it so that it's not just this thing happening over there to these people, that it will resonate with, in the same way that we saw in Parkland, right? Everyone didn't get impacted by a mass shooting, but it resonated beyond Parkland. It resonated beyond that one school. Miami Northwestern Senior High School every year has a ceremony. I'm a graduate of Miami Northwestern, go Bulls. But every year there's a ceremony, ever since I was at Miami Northwestern, which was kind of long ago, where it's called the Fallen Bull Ceremony. Every year at graduation or just before graduation, we honor our classmates who died, right? Like that is not something you expect in a high school, but it happens at Miami Northwestern every single year since I graduated. How do you get that beyond the community? Because like you said, the community know it's happening. It's not an anomaly where it's happening. People recognize that it's very real, but it's not always very real from outside of the neighborhoods that it's happening in.
I think if you take a lot of the politics out of it and have conversation, I think, the first person, people look at is the NRA. The NRA is the bad guy. The NRA is preventing us from doing everything. I think people probably need to take a different approach to it and sit down and have a conversation and take the politics out of it with the NRA, because it's obviously they represent a lot of, the gun owner, the gun manufacturer, and the gun seller. I think if there's without the politics, and there's a conversation with the NRA in trying to work together with them, you know, I think it'll be a totally different issue. Like when you look at this election just happened, they were just talking about it before, where Andrew Gillum lost the election in our opinion.
We're still counting though.
But
there's no election results yet as of today.
When you looked at every debate, and he mentioned his fight with the NRA, that did not resonate with black folks in the inner city. And that's why when you look at the amount of people who voted, the black folks in the inner city, the numbers wasn't high. Because you know what? Those people they want their guns. They don't want you to take their guns away. Unfortunately, because they need their guns to protect themselves from the killers that are not going to jail.
That's an interesting point you make, and we don't talk about this enough. And I covered a story about the Black Gun Club here in South Florida, that when we talk about gun ownership, partisanship aside, we forget that there are different groups of people who own guns. And as you point out, in predominantly black neighborhoods in Miami-Dade County, everywhere, people have legal guns. I know a 7-year-old woman who lives in Miami Gardens who loves her guns. She has a gun cabinet, you know? So that there is not just this stereotypical idea that is presented, that it is a lot bit more nuanced than...
Yeah, I mean, it's deep because you're sitting there, you know, and you're in fear of your life every day because you know the murderer live next door to you. He is not going to jail. His friend is going to murder because he didn't see his friend go to jail. And it's okay to murder because nobody's going to jail. So then you have, you know, the family with the father who can't move out of the area. He has to protect his family. So he then has to go purchase him a gun. He might not necessarily want the gun, but he has to protect the family, which is what every man and woman does for their families. So it's a vicious cycle, and it needs to stop. I mean, it's just like, and I was saying to the end, everybody needs to take responsibility for it and not just look at the TV and say, oh, it's those people over there in that community. Everybody, and just like, you know, the gentleman said on the end, it's education. I mean, you go in some of these schools right now, and you look at the opportunity, educational opportunity that they have, it's virtually not good. And I'm working in the schools every day, and I'm working, you know, with different, you know, board members and everything. The opportunity in these communities are not as good as the opportunities of every other community, and it's bad. It's very bad. It's a setup for failure, and it's a setup for nothing but more violence because we're all failing the people in that community.
And on that note, we're going to have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any.
I've got a long list of questions for you today.
Probably won't get to them all, but
unsurprisingly,
let's try to get to as many as possible.
So the first one, and this, many questions came in along these lines. Guns clearly provide unparalleled means to commit violent acts, but isn't the core issue of the runaway culture of violence in Florida and in the United States? How do we ramp that culture down?
Who wants to take that? Everyone can't answer, but.
Yes. Yes, we need to ramp the culture of violence down. Violence is not good. And I think that's a majority position. Mm-hmm. And even if you're talking about assault weapons, you're not talking about other weapons. And I own a weapon. It's not an assault weapon. Mm-hmm. But it's a cultural glorification of violence. I think that's what you're talking about, that we need to examine ourselves and what are we teaching kids? What are we teaching kids?
Bob, this question came in directly for you. It states, we probably all can agree that there are issues of mental health that we need to work on in Florida, but we can all agree that there are other societal issues that need to be solved too, that are variables to contributing to gun-related injuries and deaths. But what is the important reason to, quote, not significantly change gun access laws if, in the timeline of life, we can probably more rapidly reduce gun-related injuries and deaths by controlling guns than we can by solving these larger societal problems?
That's a big, long, complicated question. I think Luther hit it on the head. This is not simply a reduction, an increase of gun control equates to fewer deaths. I mean, the statistics don't bear that out. You're living in a very large, very complicated state. The statistics that I started with, we live in a state that has the highest ownership of concealed carry permits in the country, higher than Texas. And it's the same state that restored the rights of felons to vote, as they should have. And so it moves, if we move in that direction, how do you speak to the neighborhoods that Luther's talking about? How do you speak to the father who he referenced, or Black Gun Owners Association, or what was it you called?
Yeah, it's a Black Gun Club.
Yeah, yeah. So it's far more complicated than we need more gun control. And that was kind of what I said a little bit earlier. The cliches of the gun debate, much like the cliches of so many other discussions, which are directly related to the amped up sense of anger on both sides of the aisle, 24-hour cable news, which every day is a horse race, and the issues win or lose in that moment. It's far more than that. There has to be an opportunity for young people. I'll say again, your chances of feeling or being exposed to gun violence should not be defined by your zip code. It just simply should not. And meaningful K-12 education, economic opportunity, neighborhood security, those are issues, mental health aspects of understanding domestic abuse, domestic violence, stalker laws, those kinds of things. And even though the shooter in Tallahassee, for example, would not have fallen under those, there were flags that were already there in terms of his mental health. Those are other ways to look at this. And if we move in that direction, it crosses party lines. We're not talking about more gun control, less control, which is divided right down the middle for most intents and purposes by party. And then things become more complicated and more emotional. But the issues that I'm speaking to speak more to one-on-one relationships, association relationships, neighborhoods. And I think that's an opportunity that is often missed in the discussion about guns and gun violence.
Bob, one more for you before I move to the number of questions we have for Megan. And the question for you, Bob, is will you support additional state resources to pay for additional mental health services needed to tackle one component of this problem?
I can't support anything, and I'm certainly not here to speak in that way, but I do believe, to answer the question, there needs to be more mental health funding at the state level. Now, that's a broad response, okay? And as an organization that believes in limited government and free enterprise, we are not for just throwing more money at something without accountability and understanding where exactly it's going. So to answer the question, absolutely. We believe there needs to be more research on mental health. There needs to be more funding and support of mental health centers, but not without accountability and not without understanding exactly where those dollars go.
Megan, many members of this audience are interested in knowing more about the kind of support you feel you receive, whether that is through health insurance, whether it is the private sector, whether it is family support that you're receiving to continue dealing with the both mental and physical problems you described.
I think it'd be easier to talk of the lack of, but I do have a very supportive family, and I do have people who I've met throughout my activism who helped me to get whatever resources it is that I need, and oftentimes I become the resource for myself. I've had 3 mental health care providers, and my therapist, I've actually separated myself from all 3 of them. The best one was the 4th one because it was me. Only I could really dig deep and heal some of the things that were happening internally, because I was working with, and not to say they weren't doing their job, but I was working with therapists who did not understand what it was really like to go through what I'd been through. So for them to sit in front of me and talk to me about what was okay, what was normal, and the ways that I was feeling, and trying to make that an okay thing to something that was not normal and okay to begin with, is something that I had a problem with. So I've become someone who does peer support groups, and I get support from my peer support groups just as much as I provide them support as well. But outside of that, it's really just family, and it's really just finding out what works for me in terms of self-care, and for me that's journaling and meditating, and I just do that, and it's getting out and talking to the kids who are the youth who don't have someone to talk to and saying, I get it, and we kind of get through things together.
I'm going to skip all of the UN football questions that came in for Uncle Luke.
Thank you.
Nadege, the final question is for you. What do you see as the connection between our opioid issue and gun violence?
I really have not seen a lot of connection, at least not here in South Florida.
It's a big connection. It's a big connection.
with opioid and gun violence. I've not reported on the specific connections on opioid and gun violence. I'm not saying there isn't any connection between opioids and gun violence. I think anytime you have illicit drug trade, specifically like say for example in Overtown where it has been an opioid hub, you are going to see some measure of gun violence, especially around territory when it comes to protecting your territory around drugs. And I think that has always been a mainstay when it came to whether or not there was actively a drug trade happening that's concentrated in an area. So definitely there's that, but I have not been reporting or doing any reporting specifically on those connections. Much of the reporting on gun violence that I've done has centered around gun violence as a public health issue, regardless of how it came to be, but now that it is, that someone got shot in our community, beyond the crime story, which is absolutely a part of the story, crime and the court stories of what happens after shootings happen is a story. But also, stories are stories about survivors. We found at WLRN, for example, that there weren't many people talking to survivors, what it meant to survive gun violence, which is why we started the Young Survivors series. And beyond just surviving, what it means to be a survivor of gun violence, not just the direct victim, but the indirect victims, what it means to be a sibling of someone who lost their brother or sister to gun violence. I spent a lot of time with parents of murdered children. A lot of people may not realize this, but we have 3 regional support groups for parents who have lost children to gun violence. One in South Miami-Dade County, run by Romania Dukes, parents of murdered children of Miami-Dade County, and in West Palm Beach, there is also a support group for parents of murdered children. All of these groups were started by women who lost their children to gun violence in their communities. And what struck me is that not one of these groups are literally 501c3s, or they did not come from institutions. They came from within themselves because they realized that there was nothing else for them. So there weren't health institutions that came in and said, hey, we noticed there was a shooting in this area. Perhaps we should come in and provide this type of support. And so the type of reporting I've been looking at is how neighborhoods and people respond and provide those solutions, even if on a smaller scale, and if given the resources, what would that look like on a larger scale? And on that note, we have about a minute left, so I would love for you all to actually end and wrap up starting from the end on any final thoughts, and then we can go.
I think this has been an incredible opportunity for a lot of folks from lots of different backgrounds to come together meaningfully and talk about a very important issue for the state. And I think the panel, I think all of the panels, you and the audience reflect the diversity of the state. I mean, as Florida goes, so goes the country. And I think we need to remember that as we make our decisions on a whole host of different topics today.
I just believe we need to use all our tools. And that means from the community to the state, education, healthcare. And I think there can be a bipartisan overall agreement to limit the use of military weapons in the state because they do kill more people. And we can come together on that and as well as the rest of these issues for the community.
For me, I would close by just saying, like Luther said, you don't have to be from a community to help heal a community. So if I think that we've realized that it's no longer a taboo to talk about gun violence, it's more so a taboo to talk about and implement things that will actually be solutions to preventing gun violence. So if you do have solutions, just give it a try, because anything at this point will work more than what we're doing, which is a whole lot of talking and nothingness after it. So if we could do something out of this, I'd love it. Thank you.
I would say is we just come together as one Miami and not just look at one part of Miami and say that that's just the norm. That's really not the norm. The people that we work with every day, just like this young lady sitting here, and the groups that you spoke about. 99.1% of those cases, I'm pretty sure you know, are unsolved. And that is sad. You know, when we live in a community and she can get shot, and all those support groups and those parents who are looking for their murderers and can't get the police on the phone, that is sad. And if everybody in the entire community and people in this room, when they do see these issues happening in one side of the community, support that community. I mean, just get on the phone and demand from your law, from your politicians in your area, you know, demand that you support that side of the community in every aspect of what we've talked about right now today.
And that's a wrap for our panel. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Nadege, thank you very much. Panelists, thank you for sharing your thoughts and perspective with us. Thank you, Luther. Appreciate it very much. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.